Hi, Dr. Parara. Thank you for joining us here on one of Greece 200's informational videos that we do for everyone. Today, we're going to be discussing a little bit about the bicentennial and specifically shedding a new perspective on what the fruits of the Greek Revolution were for the revolting Greeks, as well as take a different interpretation on the cultural setback, or not so much, that the Greeks had under Ottoman rule. What do you have to say about that?
Yes, thank you, Alexander, for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and be part of this National Hellenic Student Association project celebrating the bicentennial of the Greek War of Independence. I am Polyvia Parara, and I teach at the University of Maryland, College Park, in the Modern Greek Studies program. As you said, today we're going to highlight some other aspects of the pre-revolutionary Greeks that will give a different perspective of the outcome of the War of Independence. We're gonna discuss like the positives of that war, but also some other goals that have not been met based on the political project of the pre-revolutionary Greeks. And this new interpretation is based on a new historiographical approach of the War of Independence. The standard, historiography of the modernity, sees the historical process as a linear evolution. That means that what precedes like the present is inferior of what is the present. And with that reading, that means that, let's say, the ancient Greek world and the evolution of the Greek world through the centuries is inferior from the modern as compared to the modernity. So we're gonna propose a different reading of history that use the variant of freedom as a measure of what is more advanced and what is less advanced in terms of politics. This new approach has been introduced by the former dean of the Pantheon University of Political Sciences, Professor Georgios Kontogiorgis, who has written a new series of volumes on the continuity of the Greek nation. And his work is entitled Το Ελληνικό Κοσμοσύστημα, the Greek Cosmos System. So Professor Kontogiorgis proposes a narrative of Hellenism based on the evolution of the notion of freedom from antiquity and the born of democracy and the evolution of the Greek city-state throughout the centuries. That is to say, in the kingdom of Alexander the Great, under the Roman Empire, in the Byzantine cosmopolis, in the Greek communities in the Ottoman Empire, to the War of Independence. And he argues that the foundational values of Hellenism and its existence is based on a freedom, and that the understanding of freedom in the Hellenic Greek world is very different from the West. And I will explain why.
I look forward to discussing more about how even during 400 years of subjugation, those foundational values of democracy that we carried through those different eras and times allowed us not to be set back from other Western countries during the same time period.
Very nice, because this is exactly the topic of because I have focused on primary sources that presents the foundational values of Hellenism to the War of Independence.
Wonderful. So let's start off with sort of a general question first. What were the goals of the Greeks when they were revolting against their Ottoman oppressors?
Yes, like to my view, the goals were the national independence from the Ottoman despotism and also a political project of democracy.
Okay.
So, to celebrate the bicentennial anniversary of the heroic national revolution, we must look more closely at the primary sources and evaluate who was the Greek revolted and his goal. Which were the foundational values of Hellenism on the eve of the Greek War of Independence? What was the national and political project of the revolted Greeks? So to answer these questions, I will focus on three primary sources, three groups of primary sources. The first is the modern Greek Enlightenment philosopher Rigas Phereos. Rigas Phereos wrote political text on man's rights, on a revolutionary declaration for laws and fatherland, and a revolutionary proclamation, and his own constitution that he called it Constitution of Elliniki Δημοκρατία, that includes 124 articles. The second primary source that I'm going briefly to present today is the Politia of Melenikou. Melenikus was a city, a community, and I'm going to use this word kinon many times in today's presentation because kinon is the community, and the Greeks used to live in the Ottoman Empire in Greek communities. And these communities enjoyed a level of autonomy. And this answer to your question a little bit of how you can see like a kind of autonomy under the Ottoman oppression. So
Okay.
the Ottomans basically allowed the Greeks to live in the way they organized in the previous situation, the Byzantine times. In the post-Byzantine era, they lived in the same way in their communities. And that means that they were free to believe in the Christian religion. I know maybe this sounds weird, but the Patriarchate of Constantinople like maintain its authority as a spiritual leaders of the Christians under the Ottoman Empire and maintain its privileges. And also the Greeks maintained their way to organize themselves into communities, rule themselves by electing their officials, given that they were part of the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
So we're going to study the constitutional chart of a kinon. The kinon is called the kinon, the Politia of Melenikou in the northern Thrace. Today is in the southern part of Bulgaria, in the northern part of Greece. And this is a document that is dated in 1813, that is 8 years before the revolution. So it gives a clear idea of how were the Greeks under the Ottoman Empire a few years before the revolution. And the third part of sources that we're going briefly examine are the revolutionary constitutions, the ones that were drafted during the revolution, 1822, 1823, and 1827. And after having examined like these primary sources that reflect the political values of the Greeks, then we can compare them against the outcome of the Greek War of Independence, which was the foundation of the modern Greek state in 1832, which was a monarchy. with a Bavarian king and without any constitution. So let's go start with Rigas's political project entitled Ελληνική Δημοκρατία. First of all, who was Rigas? Maybe I need to make a very brief presentation. Who was?
That would be good.
For the audience to have an idea. So Rigas Phereos was a Greek writer, a political thinker, and a revolutionary himself. He was a pioneer of the Greek War of Independence and a martyr who died in 1798, a year after he had published his revolutionary writings. Rigas Phereos is remembered by all the Greeks as a national hero. Rigas was educated at the school of Ambelakia, his hometown in Larissa, and later he became a teacher himself. He went to Constantinople and he became a secretary to the Phanariot Alexander Ypsilantis, who was the leader of the Greek War of Independence. Later, arriving in Bucharest, the capital of Vlachia, Rigas returned to school, learned several languages, and eventually became a clerk of the Wallachian prince Nikolaos Mavrogenis. I digress here to say that the Greek Phanariots, who were the aristocracy in the Byzantine world, have very high position in the Ottoman Empire. Because they were very skilled politically, they're diplomats, they spoke languages, and they have a very profound education. Around 1793, Rigas went to Vienna, and he edited and published his political map of Magna Charta of Greece, a card of Greece, which included a lot of information. It was not only a map, it was also a historical narrative of Hellenism that any reader could approach as much as his education allows. So he composed a work that was a representation of Hellenism in the form of a map, but it has so many symbolism that the more you're educated, the more could go deeper to decode this map.
Because there was a historical on top of a geographic layer to the charting of this.
Exactly. Like, to give you an example, he has Thermopylae, he has Marathon, Delphi, all the historical and mythological narratives of Hellenism, because it has also the gods and their symbolism. The main figure is like the freedom. That's the idea. And he printed these pamphlets based on the principles of Hellenism and of the revolutions of his time, because definitely he was also inspired by the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And the mainstream historiography argues that these two revolutions shapes Rigas's political formation, but the alternative historical narrative that I'm proposing is that yes, definitely he was influenced by the revolutionary movements of his time, but also he has the model of the Greek polis in the as presented in the communities that present like a community of political autonomy and self-representation and self-government within the Ottoman Empire. So we cannot ignore that reality that was the reality of the post-Byzantine Greek in the Ottoman Empire.
So the Western countries that were already experiencing revolutions or had successfully revolted, he maybe viewed them as a medium, as a channel to go back to a more democratic foundation, rather than using those countries as an end goal for Greece.
Yes, definitely. And he was inspired by the fact of the revolution itself, that the nations, if they have a goal, they have like the strength to revolt.
Correct.
But what I'm arguing today is, and I will try to show at least, is that Rigas was not inspired democracy by the West.
Correct, but by Greece's history.
Was a living reality in the communities through the that he entitles it New Political Constitution of the Inhabitants of Roumeli, which is, let's say, what is Greece today and a little bit Northern Balkans, Asia Minor, the islands of the Aegean, and the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia. So that means that his political vision includes not only other Orthodox Christians that were the inhabitants of the Greek millet, because the Ottoman Empire has divided the empire into millets, and the Greek millet far exceeded the territories of the Greece of today. So it included all the Orthodox Christian nations of the area. So his vision was a pan-Balkan uprising against the Ottomans. Unfortunately, Rigas was arrested 1 year after he printed all these revolutionary works in Trieste by the Austrian authorities. The Austrian authorities were very anti-revolutionary and very conservative and allied to the Ottoman Empire. And he was handed over to Belgrade's Ottoman governor, and he was imprisoned and tortured. And then for Belgrade, he was sent to Constantinople, and while in transit, he was strangled to prevent any eventual enterprise of rescue. And he was thrown into the Danube River. So he has this very tragic end. His last words are reported as being, "I have sown a rich seed. The hour is coming when my country will reap its glorious fruits." That's why in the Greek iconography, we see him as like putting the seeds of freedom in the Greek land.
So not to be interrupting you, but you just mentioned that his vision was for Greece to reap the fruits of the seed that he sowed. And you had earlier mentioned what the goals of the revolting Greeks were. Did they reap those benefits? Did they meet the goals that they had set out when they were first revolting?
The Greeks revolted for freedom or death. Ελευθερία ή θάνατος was like their motto for the revolution. And they fought heroically to achieve the goal of freedom. But they got the gift of independence
from the Ottomans.
But their political project has not been met, as we're going to see later. To go back to Rigas, in his revolutionary proclamation, Rigas envisioned a revolt, as I said before, of all Balkan nations, including the Turks, against Ottoman despotism. So his vision was to replace the Ottoman Empire with Ελληνική Δημοκρατία, under the rule of law, by giving to all nations, including the Turks, a better condition of life. So it was a national independence for the Greeks, but also he had the project of Ελληνική Δημοκρατία in his mind.
A human revolution.
Yes, and that includes also what was the Greek millet of his time, all the Orthodox nations of his area. He proposes a new administration under the rule of law. His ideas about freedom, as he says, went back to the glorious Greek ancestors. Regas invites the Greeks to embrace the valuable freedom of the ancestors. I quote, «εναγκαλιζόμενοι την πολύτιμην ελευθερίαν των ενδόξων προπατώρων». Of course, against the inhuman tyranny of the Ottoman despotism. The qualitative features of glorious ancestors' freedom, the Greeks, are differentiated from the liberty of the West as follows. The Greeks experienced an amount of autonomy within the communities in the Ottoman empires. They used to have gathering assemblies within the kina of the Ottoman Empire. And in these assemblies, everyone was participating, regardless of property or social status. And the Greek kinon also was inspired by the spirit of collectivity, being the kinon, the community, solidary to all its members. To say this in other words is that the Greeks understand themselves not as an individuals, but as a member, as members of a community. That the community is responsible for every individual.
And that every individual is also responsible for the community as a whole.
Exactly. But I'm saying that because the West has a different approach regarding the individual. The West has a different history. The West exits feudalism in the Middle Ages. He exits feudalism. He seeks for individual freedom. The Greeks in the Byzantine world at that time, they enjoy individual freedom. They are free. They are not like the vassals of a lord in a feud, in the feudalism. They are free. So we have like two different realities regarding how they envision freedom.
Two different terminologies, two different interpretations of freedom.
And historical realities. Yeah. The Greeks lives in freedom. They live in freedom in various forms. The West has feudalism, which means they do not have freedom, and they have to gain these freedoms, to give the individual human rights, freedoms. And also the model for the West is the monarchy. They're monarchies.
So based off of what you've just told me, would you consider that the pre-revolutionary Greeks were politically inferior to the Europeans of their time?
No, I don't believe that. Let's say, I will give you another example. We're going to see the Politia of Melenikos, but also I'm using another example of the Politia of Chios, the island of Chios. The island of Chios in 1821, when the War of Independence outbroke, was almost completely autonomous. They were self-governed, and they have only the obligation to pay the tribute to the Sultan. But the Ottoman authorities have let them do their own businesses, shipping businesses. They were very rich. I don't know if you have visited the island of Chios, but you can.
I have indeed.
Yes, the neoclassical like mansions and all this wealth that the Chians they have, the ships, the mercantile activities like manufacture and all this like wealth. And politically, they were, to my opinion, I believe based on the source, were much more advanced than the ordinary citizen of France or Great Britain at the time, that only 8%, let's say, vote in
But
Great
but
Britain
but
at that time.
were the residents of Chios voting for their self-governing representatives?
Yeah, of course, they elect their magistrates, and the magistrate like administer justice and all the affairs in the community of Chios.
That is
So,
indeed
so
that is indeed seeing history from a different lens.
exactly. And so the Greeks, having said that, experienced an amount of autonomy within the community, having these gatherings and assemblies. Let's see a little, very briefly, Rigas' man's rights, and here's like political constitution, that include like the alienable natural rights of equality, freedom, and life, also meritocracy, tolerance, equality before the law. He also states that the law derives from the people's will and approval, and it ordains only what is just and useful for the people. Rigas relate justice with freedom. In Articles 8 and 23, he introduces a spirit of collectivity in the public realm. The individual conditions relies on the actions of the entire community. That means that if a citizen is poor and has not the means to pay the taxes, the community is responsible for that payment. We do not have this spirit of collectivity in the West. Any act of injustice to an individual is an act of injustice against the whole community. In Article 9, he makes clear that a corrupted administration should be recalled by the people. Article 18 is against any form of slavery, any form. And I digress here to say that in the Byzantine world, we do not have slavery from 8th century and on. There are no slaves. In Article 21, 22, and 23, the community is solidary to those in need, reflecting the distribution of taxes in the Greek kina. In Article 22, he introduces a generalized plan of education to all citizens, including male and female, and all the citizens, regardless property. Articles 24 and 26 introduce the concept of autokrator laos. That means laos, the people who commands everything. In Article 30, he describes the officials as the people's servants. This idea derives from the tradition of the Greek city-state, that the magistrates are servants of the people. And this brings us to the second primary source that I would like to discuss today, the Politia of Melenicou, the Kinon of Melenicou in 1813. So the Melenicou Kinon was first published in the Seraika Chronicles in 1938. And it was republished by George Kontogiorgis that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation in his work, Social Dynamics and Political Self-Government in the Greek Communities under Ottoman rule in 1982. So let's explore a few provisions that clarify the political tradition of Hellenism in the Ottoman Empire, these foundational values that I mentioned before. First of all, the Constitution of Melenicou and the other similar constitutions of other communities are confirmed by the hierarch despot Anthimos in the name of the individual Trinity, proving that the church and the people are a single body in the communities of the Ottoman Empire. I make a digression here to say that the Greek word ecclesia derives from the ancient Greek assembly of the people, η Εκκλησία του Δήμου, which was the sovereign body of the ancient democracy. So it's very important to see that Hellenism maintains the same word for the sovereign body of democracy and what we call church, ecclesia, because ecclesia, literally, it's an assembly, it's a gathering. Not to mention the term kinonia, which in Greek, kinonia is the society, and in the ecclesiastic language is the communion, which shows a different understanding of the human relations within a community.
Does it also show how interconnected and interdependent the state and the church have been in Greece for a longer period of time than in many other countries?
To the present.
Yes, to the present.
To the present. In the communities of the Ottoman Empire, let's say the assembly of the church and the assembly of the kinon is the same people. And the church is an authority that, let's say, administers the unwritten laws within the community. So it's an authority because speaking that we are under the Ottoman Empire, of course, there is like a justice like administered by the Ottoman authorities. But this was the case if the Greeks did not resolve their issues among the community. So the Greeks tried to resolve like their issues within the community instead of referring to the Ottoman authorities. So the church has a very important role in this kina.
Was there also religious freedom at the time, since the church was clearly playing a role, at least in the community affairs?
As I said in the beginning, the Ottomans allow the Christians to go to church. Of course, there's the sufferings of Islamization, which was caused by the fact that the Christians, not the Greeks, I correct myself, the Christians paid heavy taxation as compared to the Muslim. So the Ottoman authorities makes it very hard to be a Christian, to say that differently.
So if a Greek was Muslim, they would pay different taxes than a Greek that was a Christian.
Exactly. If he was converted to like Islam, he wouldn't pay the taxation that was imposed to Christians, and it was a very heavy one. So that was another way to oppress Christianity. But in terms of religious freedom, as I said before, the Patriarchate of Constantinople was recognized as the spiritual leader of Christians within the empire. And the church maintained its privileges also. So it's not like, it's very like consistent that we see that the church also supervises these communities. It's part of that communities. The text that this constitution is written is Greek, in the Greek language. We need to mention that because I said before that it is Meleniko. It was a city in the southern part of what is Bulgaria today and the northern part of Greece in the border. But we need to understand that this is a Greek spoken world for the time. That does not mean that there is no people who speak Slavic or other languages, but Also, it's an area that the communities, the Greek communities, of course, speak Greek. The assembly of the public is addressed as polite melenikou. And for me, that is very fascinating, that although the Greeks are subjects of the Ottoman Empire, they call themselves polite. Πολίτες δηλαδή, πολίτες του Μελένικου. This is how they call themselves. So we have here the phenomenon that goes back again to the questions you made before. Of you're curious of how Greeks have freedom under the Ottoman Empire, and you're right to make that question. They're subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but within their communities, they are polite. They maintain the dignity of the citizen.
And as you mentioned, they also retain some rights, because a lot of what has to do with citizenship has to do with rights as well, that citizens are entitled to certain rights.
Yes, like as I mentioned before, all these polite participate in the assembly. They share equally.
Selected their own magistrates.
Yes, they elect their magistrates, like they follow like the principles and the rules of the community. They're accountable like to their magistrates, and the magistrates are accountable to them, and they're solidary to each other. So the public representatives in this like kinon, and in most of those, they are synodic body. It's not one. There are a number of magistrates. And in this specific one, they have 3 epitropous from the church, commissioners, and 3 ephors from the people. And these are elected by the kinon to represent the kinon. One thing that it's very important is that if one of these 6 magistrates was dysfunctioning, and let me explain what I mean dysfunctioning, the decisions should be taken unanimously. So they have to all agree on the decisions. So that's also a democratic way of representing people. And I digress to say here that the Patriarchate of Constantinople has this synodic like procedure.
Still do.
Yes, as opposed to the Catholic Church, that they have this hierarchy of the Pope, like the Greek Orthodox like authorities, ecclesiastic authorities are synodic. They have all to agree, and they have a seal cut in parts, and they have all put their parts to seal the decision, which shows like that's a democratic procedure. So if one was dysfunctioning, or he did not want to serve, he had to pay to be to be like, let's say,
relieved of his duty.
Yes, from his duty. That means that he has an obligation to serve. And as I said before, as Riga said, that the officials are servants of the people. So they have this sense of duty to serve, and to serve well and in a functioning way. Otherwise, they had to pay a fine. And then another one was to be elected. And the Constitution says that in case that he denies to pay the fine, then the church is gonna like excommunicate him. That's how the church has power, because there was no other way to implement.
They couldn't jail people because
Exactly.
The justice system belonged to the Ottomans.
Exactly. So they have the authority of the church, who was a very important authority among the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, like to maintain the order and the harmony within the Kinon. So, and as I said before, the assembly includes brothers of all ranks without any discrimination and elects the 6 officials of the Kinon, and the 6 officials of the Kinon of the community remain accountable and revocable at any time. That means that if they do something that was wrong, they can revoke them. And also Melanikos cotton traders and manufacturers and other artisans contribute financially to the public fund. So the Kinon has a big fund. So which are the purposes of this Kinon? It was the maintenance and increase of the capital, of the funds, to make the Kinon wealthier and more prosperous. It was the smooth operation of the manufacturers, the maintenance of schools in the Kinon, helping to meet the needs of poor and needy of the Kinon, to show solidarity to those who cannot pay, to take care of orphans, of the sick, and of the needy in general, but not of those who are irresponsible and lazy. For those members, they don't feel any obligation. And the Kinon takes care even of the prisoners. It says explicitly that they have to that they are responsible to provide the means of food and heating to the prisoners. And also another goal is a moral edification of the youth of the Kinon, based on the principles of Hellenism and the progress that the students saw in the schools. So that was also the job of the 6 magistrates to supervise. So we see that the foundational values of the Kinon of Melainikou align with Rigas' political project about the political participation of the Kinon members in the political life of the community and the spirit of solidarity and collectivity. Hellenism is not based, as we discussed before, on the rise of the individual and its rights as in the West, but rather Hellenism is based on the idea of the prosperity of the Kinon that allows its members to prosper. This is a foundational difference between the Greek world's political identity as compared to the West. I do not know if that's clear enough.
It is.
Yeah. So let's move now to the last part, the revolutionary constitution.
So I think that based off of what you just said, I would like to ask, how does the modernity of the West understand democracy then? Because we had ancient Greece and its city-states and democracies within those city-states, but a great amount of time elapsed and every country adopted different forms of republics or democracies, autocracies. What was the view at the time of democracies?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'm going to answer this question now, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit further towards the conclusion of this. But because I do not want to leave any question without answer, I will give you an answer. Like in the 18th century, a classicist that was named Benjamin Constant wrote an essay comparing the liberty of the ancient as compared to the liberty of the moderns. So,
and the moderns in which time period?
His time, the 19th century.
Okay.
So exactly what you asked, how the West understands democracy. I have to tell in general that the word democracy is very repulsive to modernity of that time. Imagine the Europe. What is Europe? Monarchies. Even after the French Revolution, we have the restoration of monarchy, right? Great Britain has a constitutional monarchy. All the other entities are monarchies. Russian Empire has a Tsar. It's an absolute monarchy. So like democracy of the ancients does not sound very good to them because it's a threat to their political existence.
Even the United States, which was one of the first nations to completely espouse a more democratic form of governance compared to the monarchies which they revolted against, the founding fathers very consciously decided to pursue a republic over democracy.
Very right. You're very right. Because the idea is the following. They have an eclectic approach of the ancient world. Although all these countries admire the Greek civilization and the classical world, they have an eclectic position, which is the following. They opt for the aesthetic values and the ideals, but not of the political project of democracy itself, which actually produces everything that they found marvelous and wonderful and important. But they don't want that. So they opt for a mixed constitution that Polyvius proposes in his book, that combines elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of democracy, and gives what has taken in the West the form of the republic rather than the democracy of the ancients. And we will go back to that later.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. But I answered part of the question, right?
Yes, 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 indeed.
Good, thank you. So the revolutionary constitutions are like the democratic ones with the liberal articles are three, the one of 1822, 1823, and 1827. The Greek constitution of 1822 was a document adopted by the First National Assembly of Epidaurus on January 1st, 1822. Formally, it was a provisional regime of Greece, προσωρινόν πολίτευμα της Ελλάδας, and has been considered to be the first constitution of modern Greece. It was an attempt to achieve a temporal governmental and military organization to deal with the needs of the revolution. I quote here that an article in Sector B, paragraph B, is that all the indigenous inhabitants of the Greek territory who believe in Christ are Greeks. So this is a very broad definition of Greeks. All the indigenous inhabitants of the Greek territory who believe in Christ are Greeks. This Greek territory, we don't know what is the territory during the revolution, right? But I believe it makes sense to think of the Greek millet, what was under the Ottoman administration, the Greek spoken world, the Orthodox millet, the Christians.
So you're not restricting Greece at the time to the boundary, the geographic boundaries of the independent Greece, which actually was.
Definitely not, because the first modern Greek state was much, much smaller than what it is now. So since you mentioned that, the Greek kingdom in 1832 was Peloponnese, a part of the mainland up to Thessaly, not Thessaly, the island of Evia and Cyclades, that's all. That was the Greek kingdom. So when we talk about Greek territory of people who believe in Christ, this is the entire...
Hellenism at large.
Yes, Hellenism at large, exactly. So the definition of Greek is that of the one who lives in the Greek world of the time, the Greek spoken world. And in Riga's political project, this world includes what is Greece today, plus the Northern Balkan states, the Asia Minor, the Pontus, that, as I said before, was the Greek millet in the Ottoman Empire, namely the Greek Orthodox, the Orthodox population of the empire. And also it says that the person who is Christian Orthodox born in this entire area and also speaks Greek as a native speaker. Έχοντες ελληνική φωνήν Patreon. This is a Greek. So a like Greek constitution includes articles about tolerance, equality before the law, meritocracy, fair distribution, and taxation. I would like to tell you here and to your audience that the www.hellenicparliament.gr has all these constitutions, and it's a great source to go there and see all the articles of this constitution.
So it has an archive of past constitutions.
Yes. I said again, www.hellenicparliament.gr.
Thank you.
So you're welcome. The Greek Constitution of 1823 basically is the same constitution, repeats the same articles, the same principles, and it's called constitution, the law of Epidaurus, ο νόμος της Επιδαύρου, and is drafted, as I said, 1 year later in a difficult time, because now we are in the beginning of the civil war during the revolution, because unfortunately during the revolution there was a civil war that took place in the years 1823, 24 to 25. So the Greek Constitution of 1827 was signed and ratified by the Third National Assembly of Trizine during the later phases of the Greek War of Independence, and represented the first major step towards realizing a centralized system of government, pulling together some of the more desperate elements of liberation struggle. So the Third National Assembly convened in Piazza in 1826 and concluded in Trizina in 1827. This constitution and this assembly elected Ioanni Kapodistria as the first governor of Greece for a 7-year term, and it voted the Greece's political constitution. This political constitution was the most democratic and the most liberal constitution of the time. For example, it issued Catholic vote to every single citizen, regardless of property. That was not the case in the United States. That was not the case in the Great Britain and in every other
So women had the right to vote as well at the time. So women had the right to vote at the time.
Not women. Not women.
That took several years thereafter.
Yeah, not the women, but all the citizens without property, without lot, could vote. In other countries, they couldn't do that had constitutions at that time. And also, it declared for the first time the principle of popular sovereignty. Sovereignty lies with the people. Every power derives from the people and exists for the people. Also, this constitution, now alike the movement of constitutionalism, establishes the separation of powers, vesting the executive power to the governor, Ioannis Kapodistrias, and assigning to the body of representatives that was called Vouli, as it's still called the parliament, Vouli, the legislative power. Unfortunately, the first governor was assassinated. And I say unfortunately because Ioannis Kapodistrias was a patriot that tried to compromise the monarchical Europe with the values of Hellenism. But he was assassinated in 1831. This factor, in addition to the factor that the War of Independence could not be sustained without the intervention of foreign powers and their diplomatic intervention that started from 1824, but very dynamically from 1828, that have started like signing protocols of London about resolving the Greek issue.
One could argue that it started even before in 1827.
I was ready to correct myself because we have the naval battle of Navarino.
I'm from there. I had to intervene.
Yes, you did very well. It's kind of late and I'm a little bit tired. It was the first Treaty of London was the 1827. It has a secret article that allow the European Navy to fight against the Ottoman Navy and actually destroy it. And it is after this completely successful and victorious Battle of Navarino that the powers try now to impose the Greek solution of the issue. But also the other event was the 1829, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the Third Russian-Turkish War, and the Treaty of Adrianople in the Article 10 imposed to the Ottoman Empire to accept the solution of the Greek question. Because up to that point, the Ottomans did not consent to any autonomous state, independent state, whatever was on the table at that time. So the naval battle of Navarino in 1827 and the defeat of the naval power of the Ottoman Empire. And 2 years later, 1829, the Treaty of Adrianople concluded like this diplomatic back and forth with the Ottoman, the Sublime Porte, Constantinople. And finally, we have the first protocol of independence in 1830, but it takes 2 more years to go to the final treaty. So let's go now to the final treaty. The Treaty of Constantinople in 1832 establishes the full independence of the Greek state from the Ottoman Empire under the protocol that accompanied that treaty signed in May 7th of 1832 between Bavaria and the protecting powers, not the Greeks, between the Bavaria and the protecting powers. Basically was dealing about the regency because the Bavarian King Otto was a minor and he has to have regency until he reached his majority. So in this treaty, Greece was defined as an independent kingdom with the border Artavolos in the northern frontier. That was the best that Ioannis Kapodistrias managed to have, because the powers used to propose proposed a border,
more southern border.
that was, yes, more southern. So Kapodistrias fought again for this more extended border, and he made it. And of course, the Ottoman Empire was indemnified in the sum of 40 million piastres for the loss of the territory. And so the borders of the Greek kingdom were, as I said before, the northern line of Volos-Arta, southern part of that line, Peloponnese, the island of Evia, and Cyclades. So this state now was monarchical, without constitution, and under the rule of the Bavarian king and his court. The Bavarian king also brought from Bavaria 6,000 Bavarian soldiers paid by the Greek state. And also all his ministers were Bavarians. So I mentioned just Article 1, the courts of Great Britain, France, and Russia, authorized for this purpose by the Greek nation, offer Greece's hereditary sovereignty to the Prince Frederick Otto of Bavaria, second son of His Majesty, the King of Bavaria. Article 2, His Majesty, the King of Bavaria, acting in the name of his said son, a minor, accepts on his behalf the hereditary sovereignty of Greece and on the conditions hereinafter settled. And the priest Otto shall bear the title of King of Greece. Pay attention, Alexander, the King of Greece, not the King of Greeks, because many Greeks are still under the subjugation of the Ottoman Empire in Thessaly, in Epirus, in Macedonia, in Thrace, in the islands of Northern Aegean, Eastern Aegean, Dodecanese, Crete, and the Ionian Islands that are not under the Turks. They are under British rule. But let's mention the Ionian Islands as well. So what is the Greek kingdom? It's a very small kingdom.
It's a small, confined geographical space compared to what it was once and what it is now.
And now we can discuss what is the outcome. Having said that,
yes, what
do you think is the outcome, to put myself back in the role of the teacher and you the role of the student? So, and using the deductive.
We did have that relationship some years back. So it very much sounds like that the Greeks achieved their collective liberty from Ottoman rule, and that in a way, despite also being individually autonomous, they further allowed themselves to be completely free of Ottoman rule. However, in essence, and not to belittle it, it almost sounds like they exchanged the rule of the Ottomans for the rule of a foreign-born monarch, due to the fact that their democratic experiment was short-lived between Ioannis Kapodistria's untimely death, and as well as the necessary reliance on Britain and Russia and France for assistance, and therefore we owed them meddling in our affairs. It sounds like what we did was exchange one ruler for another, almost.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that the Greeks gained the independence they wanted. And we have to say here that the Greeks was the first nation in the world that revolted against an empire and gained its independence. So it was a very heroic revolution.
I just, being in the States, one would argue that the colonials revolted against the British Empire at the time and succeeded.
Yes, I would accept that.
They were not a country before. They created a country.
Yes.
Afterwards.
You're right in putting that in that terms. Yes, they revolted. Yes. Speaking about this oppression of the Ottoman Empire against like Central Europe, Balkans, and Asia Minor, from all these people, the Greeks were the first who revolted against the Ottoman Empire and gained the independence. But as you said, this independence was not the independence they envisioned in terms of political, of their political project. In the political project, the War of Independence did not bring the fruits that the Greeks wanted.
And the Riga Ferreo had envisioned as well.
Exactly. Yes, Riga Ferreo and the revolutionaries in the beginning of the revolution, they didn't envision to have a Bavarian king without constitution and 3 protective powers to interfere in their politics and make decisions that they were not for the benefits of the Greeks, of course, but first of the benefit of their own interests first. So in that way, Hellenism did not succeed in the political project, but it
In the
did
sh- it-
succeeded in the national project.
and I would say it did not succeed in the short term. And this is where I want to maybe give you the opportunity to give some perspective to our viewers on just how long it took for Greece to unite in its more current geographical boundaries, and how long it took for us to go from monarchical rule under King Otto to a constitutional democracy.
Yes, thank you for saying that, because we have to say here that the Greeks, they didn't like that from the very beginning. So very early in the 1843, they revolted for a constitution. And then they keep revolting and asking for more democratic, for democratic principles, more democracy in their country. Let me say that unfortunately, the modern Greek state deconstructed completely the foundational values of Hellenism in terms of collectivity and participatory expression and the realm of politics. And why that? Because after the foundation of the modern Greek state, the Greeks became individual citizens, that they have to resolve their issues by having a negotiation, individual negotiation with the politicians. They are not in the position anymore to discuss their issues within communities and through collective processes to resolve their issues and participate in the public sphere. Now they're individuals. And even in the later time, I'm not talking about, of course, the Bavarian ministers and all this Bavarian rule in the first decades of the
post-revolution.
Yes, of the modern Greek state. Even after that, we have the phenomenon of political clientelism, patronage, political patronage, nepotism. That means that the Greek has to go to the politician and sell his vote to get what he needs.
That almost sounds like what we have in 2021.
Actually, that's why I told you that unfortunately, it's of course, we cannot be nihilistic and say that nothing has happened. Of course, like the Greeks thrive and try to prosper and try to expand the territories, and during the Balkan Wars they made it, and of course the Asia Minor catastrophe was the very sad conclusion of the great idea. Greece was limited to the borders of the Treaty of Lausanne, and then later, of course, when the German occupation came against Hellenism, resisted, and they tried to defend their freedom. But in terms of politics, the Greeks always see the state as something hostile. They didn't feel the state as being part of themselves, as it happens in the United States, or as you said before, that these people founded their own country, their own constitution. They felt they partook to this process. For the Greek, in the modern Greek state, an absolute monarchy was implanted in a body of Hellenism that could not tolerate something so strange to its own tradition. And that was very fatal for even for the coming years. Because what I tried to argue today was that the Hellenism has different political foundational principles. The Greeks, the Homo Hellenicus was the one who participates in the assemblies, who has freedom to express himself, who can elect his authorities, who thinks himself within a member of a community. This was deconstructed. One. And the second was the foreign intervention that always feel that the Greeks have some foreigners interfering in their state. So to conclude with a note of optimism is that we need to understand our present by examining this historical narrative of the War of Independence and envision a society with more democracy and more autonomy. And this is not only important for Hellenism, I could say that it's important for the world, because today the citizens, not only in Greece, everywhere, they feel somehow disconnected for the sphere of politics.
Before you mentioned that, I was actually going to say that in addition to more autonomy and more democracy, I think that to achieve more democracy, one would argue that we need to have more and greater participation. What the ancient Greeks felt was not only a privilege, but a duty of the citizens to participate in their own democracy and their own decision making. We think that if we wake up once every 4 years and drop a ballot in a ballot box, that we have done our duty. But if we do not stay informed and if we do not hold accountable during the 4 years the people we elect, we then will feel a greater distance, a greater disconnect, as you mentioned.
Exactly. So I do believe in this like differentiated narrative because it gives that perspective. If we accept the narrative of the modernity, it's like there is nothing to hope. This is how it is. That's the best we can have. That's the democracy we can have. We cannot aspire of anything else. But if we go back to the values of Hellenism, we see that there are different principles there that seeks for participation, that asks for the body of citizens to have a say in politics, to be an institution that will be asked about politics. Because when the people is involved in a meaningful way, is interested in politics, if one feels nothing he can say, nothing he can do makes a difference, they become more and more indifferent. And this, I think, is not very good for the modernity and the societies of the West. We need to seek for more democracy and more autonomy within our societies to enhance the political system we have.
Well, thank you for this very illuminating conversation. I think that you're very correct in the sense that in order to understand our present and to also build a better future, we need to examine the historical narrative, not only through one lens that we may have been taught once during school, but to continuously challenge and re-examine history as we did just now, to determine how what we've been through is affecting us even today.
Thank you. And I may sound very patriotic, but I would like to say that as like the West in the Renaissance, he went back to the classical time to revive humanism. I need that it's time again to go back to the values of Hellenism and be inspired by them to enhance the role of the citizen in modern society.
Yeah.
Because apathy is not something anyone wants who loves democratic freedoms and liberalism.
Yes.
So with that note, I would say that it was my pleasure.
It was my pleasure as well. Thank you very much for joining us. And I look forward to having everyone's feedback in the comments. And I'm sure that you would be interested on the note that we left of participation to see our viewers engage with the video and any questions they have.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much and have a good evening.
You too. Thank you.